And thank you for having me here at PyCon, where we will discuss securing your company's data, encryption, deletion, and other best practices. And as we said, this is me. I host the Secret Conference, and I started 2 crypto companies. So that's basically my cred for being here. And I'm really glad to be in Canada right now. Forgive my Justin Trudeau theme. See, who knew that he was such a fan of securing customer data? It's going to be really important in this new world that we're entering now that Trump is starting to run the US government. Reason being that a lot of people who never really thought that they'd have to concern themselves with security are starting to take this very seriously. You know, security has, for many, many years, been the realm of security nerds, crypto nerds like myself, and people who saw themselves as risks, dissidents in countries like Turkey. But very soon we're going to see people who are trans, people who identify as any number of marginalized communities, seeing themselves as at risk in America. And they're going to start looking to the companies that they use every day to protect their data. Companies that never thought that they'd have to be security companies. So suddenly all of us are in this moment where security matters to people who never thought they'd have to care about it, and companies, programmers like all of us, are suddenly in a position where our customers are going to ask us questions we hadn't anticipated. So I'm really, really glad to be here and talk about what we do when we don't necessarily have a big security team, when we don't necessarily have buy-in from everyone in the company. That's really what I want to talk about. Security is such a big topic, so we're not going to cover everything today. My hope with this talk is to cover some really basic principles that anyone can apply if you're really dedicated and under kind of the dire circumstances that were familiar to me as a startup person. So when I had a startup, I didn't have a lot of resources, I didn't have a lot of people, and we weren't necessarily security experts on day one, although we did bring some people around us to advise. The one advantage that we had, we didn't have legacy code. So if you have legacy code, that's a whole other can of worms. For what it's worth, I leave my contact information, ways to reach me at the end of this talk. And for things that I don't cover here, I'm a resource, I can connect you to resources. So with that in mind, we can't cover everything in the next 20 minutes, but we can over time, so find me later. Here are the 5 things that you can do that will be really impactful and are relatively inexpensive. And not to say anything in security is easy, but these are the things you're least likely to mess up. Minimize the data collected, encrypt that data, delete that data, restrict your data access, and find and empower someone smarter than you on all of this. So first things first, threat modeling. So you see these folks, they're sitting around a table and they're considering their possible risk scenario. Well, we've got alien invasion, city destroyed by angry monkey god, building eaten by giant pie. You know, if you really get creative, there are always risks. The question is, which risks are meaningful? Which risks are meaningful to you, to your customers, that are worth the time and energy to de-risk around? And that's called threat modeling. Threat modeling is really the first place to start when you think about security. So for example, when you look at teenagers, their threat model is that their parents and their teachers are going to read their messages. And that explains why their security concerns are different from those of grown-ups and adults who are a little bit more worried about Uncle Sam or worried about advanced hackers. So it's important when you start to sit and think, you know, who's likely to come after the data? Who are you protecting from? Are you protecting from anonymous? Are you protecting from black hat hackers who are financially motivated? Are you trying to protect marginalized people, Muslims, trans, LGBTQ against the United States government? What is it that, who's going to come at you? And that's one thing that you'll keep in mind as you figure out how you protect yourself and your customers. Now, the first step isn't encryption, it's minimization. Do I really need all this jazz? Do you actually really need to be building everything out that you have planned? Because data is valuable, but it's also a liability. We didn't always think about data this way. Data used to be really hard to transfer. So I'm relatively old. I'm old enough to not be up on, like all the memes and slang and stuff all the time. And I'm old enough to remember when it was really hard to transfer files. I remember when things just weren't by default connected to the internet. And because it used to be so hard to transfer information and really hard to store information, we developed a culture where information was valuable. And as it became really cheap and really inexpensive to collect and store information, companies started to just hoard it just in case. Companies collect a lot of data that they don't even know what they're going to do with later, just because maybe they can monetize it. And we need to start acknowledging that data may be valuable, but it may not be worth the liability. You look at the case of Yahoo, where they are taking probably $1 billion hit on the deal with Verizon on account of the data hacking that happened at that company. That was a really, really big liability. That was a really, really big risk. And so I think we're going to start to see some things start to change. That's basically it's shifting. It used to be that data was really valuable, and we're starting to appreciate data is a real liability. So I have a question for those of you here in the room. What are some data fields that you've seen collected and stored that maybe weren't necessary? If not at your company, then just as a consumer. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Postal code.
What did you say?
Postal.
Yeah, postal code. They're doing that to be precise, but they don't always need it. Where do you see that being overused?
At checkout counters.
Yeah. Yeah, they're doing that as a precaution because they're taking your credit card, but they don't necessarily need it. Anything else? Yeah, in the back.
Using a phone number.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, they're taking your phone number because they might use it to send you text messages and because collecting more data is considered to be more better. But now they're liable for that. And their brand is going to take a hit, and they're going to hurt their customers if they don't know how to protect that information. Yeah?
Landlords like to take your social insurance.
Yes. I've been asked to give my social security number so many times, so many places. And that's like really high value stuff. Hackers get your social, they can get almost everything else. And companies aren't necessarily taking protecting that as seriously as we would like. But say you do have to collect social security information, other information, you can't get around it, that's where encryption comes in. If you like it, then you better put some crypto on it. Now, for personal use and for business messaging where you don't have to log stuff, I'm a fan of Wicker and also Signal. They're both kind of different. Open Whisper Systems is open source, which is cool, but Wicker has some features that are really nice too, and they're end-to-end encrypted messaging apps. Does anyone here know what end-to-end encryption means, what the difference is? Yeah.
It just means that nothing none of the middlemen can decrypt the message.
Right.
Only the two parties sending and receiving to each other get to actually see the content.
Any other, anything else to add about end-to-end? Yes.
It presumes that the people on either ends of the nodes don't have their systems compromised as well.
Right. So there's some assumptions made, but part of what's valuable is both parties on both sides are encrypted. And so if I send an encrypted message to someone who's using Gmail, it's on plain text on their end, so it's not really secure. And that's why I like apps like Wicker and Signal, is I at least know that the message is being sent to someone who's using encryption at the other end. I don't know whether their phone is compromised. I don't know what other problems might happen, but it's a lot better than email. And that's one of the problems with using encrypted email, is you're sending your encrypted email everywhere. Now, given the scope of this talk, we're not going to do a deep dive into crypto, but I thought I would leave you with some references. So we'll post these slides up later. You don't have to worry too much about taking it down now. Bruce Schneier is one of the best thinkers on crypto, in part because he's such a great writer. So he makes it relatively accessible. And these are two really great books for an intro to applied cryptography and cryptography engineering. And then if you want to do a deeper dive into your specific kind of application, like maybe you are building an iOS app, or it's an Android app, or you're actually building car security, whatever it is, there are a lot of very specialized books, and No Starch is really, really excellent. They don't publish anything that isn't excellent, in my experience. And so it's a very reliable place for really top-notch security information for you to do a deeper dive into whatever it is that you're working on. All right, so you've collected the data, you've encrypted the data, now what? You might have to store it, which is a liability, at least it's encrypted, but ideally you can delete it. Now, I understand that a lot of companies won't have this. You can't necessarily do all of these things. These are principles that I wrote for myself when I was a founder, and I was able to kind of design the business logic. And we designed what we were doing to optimize for security and minimize our risks. So deleting the data is really good if you can. And if you can't, you may still be able to make some deletion decisions at your company, especially now that security is being more prioritized. So this talk does, I keep in mind that you can't necessarily execute everything you want to, but it's still helpful to do what you can. Delete all the data. Do you really want to delete everything? Yes. And really delete it. So this is a pet peeve of mine. Customers will delete things and companies will delete things, but it's not deleted, it's just deleted from the user interface. It's just like the user doesn't see it anymore. That doesn't mean it's really gone. It has to be deleted from the servers. So this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. This is a real conversation I had with Spotify Cares. And either they have typos in their templates, or this actually was like an off-the-cuff message. I got concerned because Spotify didn't have the best privacy policy. They were reported to be handing over data to the FBI. At the time, I actually didn't think that the FBI cared very much about me. I still don't think the FBI cares that much about me. But I was just like, screw you, Spotify, I'm out of here. And I wanted everything deleted. Just out of spite, I was mad. I'm like, you shouldn't be handing data over like this, and I don't want you to have mine. And I said, what happens to my account data? Tell me a little bit about what you do when you delete it. Tell me anything. Because their privacy policy and none of their public information had anything technical about how they do this. And deleting's hard. Deleting data is really hard because you run into questions of do you keep a record of the fact that you deleted their account? Do you keep metadata around that? It's actually a tricky thing. And I was kind of curious. And they said, everything is deleted, don't worry. Let us know if we can help with anything else. She's like, you know what? That made me really upset because don't tell me to not worry if you can't actually give me any information. I don't believe you. You just sound, I don't believe you. And this happened around the time that Ashley Madison was hacked for lying to its users. So, just don't be a jerk. You guys seem like you're not jerks. Third-party software is a big risk, and so are contractors. Employees need to be granted enough privileges to do their work, but not everyone needs to get admin. Goodness. This is really basic, but I mean, it happens a lot. I'm sure you won't do this. So you need to do identity access management. When I started as a founder, I'd been coding since '97, but there are a lot of things they don't teach you in school, and you don't learn them on the job unless you are assigned to it. So I didn't know that there were identity management tools. I didn't know that for a really long time. And then I got really excited when I discovered that they exist and that like it's really mainstream and everyone knew about this but me. So you've got Active Directory and you've got LDAP, and it's really important. When you look at some of the biggest breaches, Snowden was a really big breach. I mean, when we think of Snowden, we don't think of him necessarily as a breach, but he was a third-party contractor who had access to a lot of data, and then he leaked it. And the OPM data breach, who here, raise your hand if you're familiar with the OPM data breach, the Office of Personnel Management in the States? That's some, but not everyone. Okay, so this is really, really, really big. This was millions and millions of personnel records, social security numbers, and everything that the Office of Personnel Management gets when they talk to someone about their clearance. So what do they talk to you about when they're talking to you about clearance? It's anything that could be used to blackmail you. It's also all the United States spies. This is basically like a clearinghouse for all of the United States' most sensitive data. And it was hacked. Why was it hacked? Because root access was given to foreign nationals, which is like extremely unnecessary. So, you know, be careful who has access, right? And the last thing really is the one thing where if you get this right, a lot of things will go well for your organization security-wise. And that's to hire a chief security officer, you know, to bring someone on board who's going to really own security and watch over that and be the voice for security inside the tech team and inside the product team. Now, it can be a real challenge to hire your first security person because how do you hire them if you don't have that expertise? It's kind of a chicken and egg problem. And I do executive search focusing in the security space. So I work with companies who are trying to do this, and it gets tricky. One thing you can do is just to lean on the more security, like intelligent people in your organization. But you can also bring in someone like me, or you can bring in people who are obviously security experts as advisors. And a lot of them will come in for a day or a few days and help you with your interview process. And you can pay them, or some of them will do it because it's fun. It is actually kind of fun. A lot of things are fun. We like to work, right? People like to work. And you need to empower your CISO, otherwise you get this like tug of war. So one of the things I've seen that's been really sad is companies that are trying to be security companies, but then they let marketing make decisions and they don't give the security team the room to veto that. And so you end up with a security company implementing Google Analytics and like any number of other things that aren't really appropriate for a security product. So this is a really hard thing for executives to do. They have to be really committed. They just have to be really committed. So we could talk more about how you achieve that inside your organization. It's kind of depressing, especially like this is PyCon, we're technical people, we want to think about technical things. But actually achieving security inside your organization, which is so important. We have to talk about that. We have to think about how to do it, even if how to do it isn't that exciting. It's often just a political navigation thing. It's figuring out how to get buy-in. So much of the work that the best security people do is just making sure that they have the resources and the ability to do their job. So on that note, we are at time for questions. So you're welcome to find me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Of course, I encourage you to come to SecretCon, and I'll have a lot of diversity and scholarship tickets. So don't worry if you don't have a lot of money or you're a student. I want to try and make it an accessible event for people. And if we don't get to your questions here, again, find me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn, or find me at the rest of the event. Let's take questions.
Hi. My question is mainly, For those of us that are not in companies, right, like the consumer, if you will, where would you say is a good place to start if we want to learn about becoming more encrypted, being more secure? Because I just use Yahoo as an example. The Obama administration is much, much less problematic than Trump, but even under them, they threatened to sue Yahoo if they didn't reveal their customer data. Yahoo initially resisted, but eventually they did give in. And they were the only company that I know that even made any sort of attempt to resist. And now, with the recent leaks, they don't even try.
That's exactly right.
So I would say the first place to start for the average consumer would be themselves. So where would you say is a good place to? Because it's not always the most accessible thing to learn.
Yeah, it really isn't. And there are some resources that I found that I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can post them to Twitter later today. And I'll do that. As a place to start, I would recommend with your messaging apps. If you're going to be doing messaging that is sensitive, I would also look at encrypting your hard drive on your laptop, and if you have a Mac, that's pretty easy. I would also look at your own threat model, like what is it that you're guarding against? Are you guarding your finances against hackers, or are you guarding your communications against the government? And there are different paths for all of that. But what I'll do is post some like really introductory resources later today, and I'll hashtag it with PyCon.
Thanks so much for your talk. One question I have, and something I think about, is I question the extent to which companies are liable for data breaches. And this comes in the wake of, we hear breach after breach, and it's not clear as a consumer how much they are really affected. And I specifically think of the credit card industry works very hard to put standards around the control and management of credit card numbers. And so in the case of, this is one example of data where companies are pushed and there are real punitive actions if there are breaches inside their infrastructure for mismanaging that data. But I don't see that for much more important pieces of data like social security numbers. I wonder what thoughts you have on this topic.
I think that's right. I think that companies don't have the liability that they should have for the consequences of their actions. And if I'm a fan of capitalism, but I don't think that it's working properly. I think that you should have like more full life cycle consequences and feedback loops. What I do see is an escalation in consequences, and I think that that's good. For Verizon to start pushing back on its deal with Yahoo to the tune of at least $1 billion on account of failed security practices is a really good start. So what I would say is I think that the liability is starting to become more real, that companies are starting to take it more seriously, and that customers are increasingly becoming more aware that security is becoming an increasingly mainstream concern. But I would agree with you that it's not where it should be. And I would also say that, I would say strongly that it's not where it should be. And it's not where I hope it will be in 5 to 10 years.
Thank you for the talk. Just a quick question. What is like the best argument, at least from a company's perspective, to say, yeah, just get rid of your data? Because I mean, I work at a company that does PCI compliance, and so we avoid the credit card side of things. But other data, that's depending what kind of data, it's kind of fair game. What is the best argument to say you can let go of this data and delete it?
Right. So you have to look at what matters and what's important to the management in your company. Now, there's a cost to the maintenance of code and a cost to the maintenance of securing data over time. So it may be that your company could be persuaded that the ROI isn't there, that the data may be free, but someone's going to have to manage it, and those are man hours that could be used elsewhere. Is this really the feature that we want to be focusing on? It's going to take more resources than you would think. Max Cannon Alexander has written some good things on that. If we're looking at a company that is risk averse, they might be persuaded by the trajectory that the marketplace is taking now, where customers are caring more and business partners are caring more. So I would take a look and say, like, what's persuasive to management? And they may not be persuaded, right? Like, the hope is that more talks like this will start to change the tide, but it's not where we want it to be.
Thank you.
Found your own company.
If companies think that the data they've collected has future value, what about the options for removing it from any network, internet accessible device and keeping it offline?
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's actually a really good idea. Because what happens is all the internet accessibility is just another attack vector. And what happens is hackers tend to get into one system that's connected to another system, and then they jump around. So if you can isolate systems, if you can isolate the data, that's a great security practice. Now, it's not foolproof because someone can still get into your company, right? You look at like the Office of Personnel Management hack, you look at like the data that Snowden collected, those were all internal. You look at Sony and it looks like even the Sony hack may have happened internally. And so it has to be kept in mind that data that's accessible internally is still a risk. Your employees are a risk. They are. But it's a really good option for data that you don't want to delete. And you can't delete everything.
Sort of connecting that back to one of your original questions about what data is useful, what data about ourselves are we willing to give up because we think it might be useful for society in general. I mean, in Canada, we had, over the last government, during the time of the previous government, there was a lot of controversy over the collecting of census data. And the previous Conservative government wanted to suppress the collection of census data, largely because it knew that that data was being used to argue that the economy was going in the direction that the Conservatives wanted and impoverishing people. Right?
Census data is a really controversial thing. We're seeing that in Australia now.
Okay, but on the other hand, commercial uses of data, you go to a cash to buy something, and the tension is that you only want to give enough data about yourself to legitimize the cash transaction, credit card transaction.
I think that's right.
But the
I'm going to have
company-
to cut you off, though, to make sure. We'll have time for one more question, right? This is the last one?
Yeah.
Last question. If not, I'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Sorry to cut you off. Thank you for coming.